Hi, everybody. So first, thank you to Professor Allett and the Voluntary Core Curriculum for having me and asking me to be a part of this, especially since nobody really knows what linguistics is, and therefore oftentimes it's overlooked in programs like this. Also, as an alumna of the university and a huge proponent of interdisciplinarity and liberal arts education, I love being able to push forward the idea of linguistics across the college to folks that are studying lots of different areas. So, every great works discussion starts with what makes a work great? What makes a work great in the field? I'll just go ahead and say I'm not going to actually answer this question because there are multiple answers, and I'll kind of play with this a little bit. For me, in linguistics, looking at what are the great works of linguistics, I think about what defines the field, what advances the field, what opens the field up to other groups, audiences. Okay, this is going to be embarrassing. I had a weird dream last night where I was basically having a nightmare about this talk because I still get nervous about things. And of course, everything went wrong, and you guys were in multiple rooms, and I couldn't see anybody. But I started to say something about how defining what makes a work great, it brings light. I didn't know what that meant. And I said in my dream, I was saying that it brings insight to the people who are reading these works. And then I started saying something that sounded insightful to me, but then I woke up because a spider was crawling across my face in reality. So that was my morning. So it's only uphill from there. So I wish I had known what insightful thing I was going to say. Hopefully, working together with you today, we can get there by the end of this talk. So, the question is, what makes a work great? I'm going to be looking at some of my notes throughout, so forgive me. For us in talking about linguistics, in order to start with the great works, we also have to define not only what makes a word great, but what is linguistics, right? How many of you have taken a linguistics class or would think that you know what linguistics is? Okay, that is not the majority of the people in the room. That's fine. Most people think this is linguistics, right? Lots of people speaking lots of languages. Yay, happy things. Linguists look at linguistics more like this, where there's lots of stuff going on, people interacting. We're looking at things in terms of interactions. We're looking at what's happening in people's minds and their bodies. For linguistics, the way that we simply define it is the scientific study of language. Don't ask me what language is. That's a totally different talk. Come to one of my classes and we can define that there. The field of linguistics has been around for approximately 100 years as its own scientific study. People have been looking at and analyzing language since people started speaking, since there were people and since they started speaking. But what we're going to be doing is looking at really what linguistics is over the last 100 years. And what I'm going to do in this approach is I'm looking at what the great works are. And it was a really interesting process and really a fun process to think for the last 6 months, what really are the great works in linguistics. And what I decided to do is to define the field for you through these great works, but more importantly, talk about the great works because of how they define the field and redefine the field and advance the field and ask different types of questions. Now, not every, and I've put too many works on here, so we're going to go quickly through a lot of these. I'm happy to talk to you guys later about many of them, or again, take linguistics and we'll do it more. The choices that I made are not the same choices that my colleagues would make. Some of the choices I put on here would actually be quite controversial. Admittedly, I'm taking a particular skewed approach. I'm a sociolinguist, which means I study language and society and how language and society reflect one another. So I definitely skew a little bit that way. But I think it shows the progression of what's been going on in the field and kind of what makes these works great. I will also say that in order to understand linguistics, in order to understand the great works, and one of the things that my choice of great works will really hopefully show is linguistics is inherently interdisciplinary. It crosses the humanities, the natural sciences, and the social sciences. And the works that I'm talking about today will pull from all of those different forms. Schools, universities have a tendency to separate the disciplines and reinforce and uphold these differences. And what I want to show you guys today is that these structural boundaries of what scholarship and what knowledge is, sometimes they need to be breached. And in fact, oftentimes, especially for linguistics, what makes a work great is because it doesn't follow into one form only. It actually does cross boundaries and disciplines in various ways. So hopefully you will agree with me. If not, I'm happy to talk about it. But that's the approach that I'm going to take today. So let's get to our first one. And I've been talking all day, so forgive me if I take some breaks to hit my throat. The first work that we consider actual scientific study of linguistics, this beginning of the field, is the 1916 posthumously printed work by Ferdinand de Saussure called Course in General Linguistics. All right, this is the first thing came out. His students put these notes together, or put this book together from the notes that they took from his class, in terms of talking about not only what language is, but also what the field of linguistics was. When he wrote this book, or when he wrote his lectures, he was defining the field for the rest of us, and we're still using this as the basis 100 years later. Now, for Saussure, the key concepts, and what I'm going to be doing here today is talking about these great works, where they're coming from, and some of the key components. Again, a really quick view over multiple works so that you guys can see some breadth. So for Saussure, he was the first person to put out there that language is structure. The most fundamental part of what we need to talk about is the structural system that underlies what language is. The fact that we have a grammar, the fact that words are put together in particular forms. For him, the most important part of all of this was the concept of the sign. How many people in here know the term semiotics, or have ever looked at anything with semiotics? The fact that you can have an entity that has meaning attached to it. So for Saussure, the construct of a sign meant that we have these things that we're calling words. And it's a set of sounds that we put together in a very specific way. And when you say that word, it points to a particular thought. So if I say tree, what do you guys think about? So you're like, a tree, of course, yeah. But he's not, what he's trying to do is he's saying that this is something to not overlook, that we have this shared system, and it has to be a shared system. If I said a different word, if I said hair, and in your mind popped up a tree, and somebody else's mind popped up a pen, and somebody else's mind popped up a shoe, then we wouldn't be able to share that system. We wouldn't be able to communicate with each other. So we actually have this form, this random thing of putting these sounds together that form tree in English, and only in English, that we have this lovely picture, and the windows are covered, but you know, behind me there outside, we can see, look, tree, right? You can do that. So, and this is fundamental, and we're all sitting here like, well, yeah, but nobody had ever looked at language like that. They were looking at rhetoric, you know, Greek analyses were talking about what old languages had done, languages that had died off. They were trying to figure out, you know, how people use language. But he was saying, what is language? What is it fundamentally? What can we do with it? And so the fact that he's saying language works in this particular way, regardless of what language we're looking at, it was a really new concept for people to hold onto. He also brought forth this idea that we call a speech circuit. So I'm going to bring you into with me. So for language to work, I can come up with my idea of tree, and I put together a form through this in my speech system, and I can say tree, and all these little waveforms, they go across, and they hit Professor Owlett's ear. And in his ear, he processes these sounds tree, and in his head probably pops up a little picture of a tree. And he goes, oh, and he can understand me. And then he says, house. And the little forms go back and they hit me, and I'm like, ooh, I get the same picture. Well, not necessarily the same picture. But the idea for Saussure was speech had to be social. It had to be something that you shared with a community. It had to be something that wasn't, it existed in your mind, but you shared it in the world, okay? And because of those differences, it was just a very different view than what language had. We take him for granted, but he's absolutely the first person to come across these factors in linguistics. All right, I'm moving chronologically. So we go from 1916, we're going to jump forward to 1939, and we're actually going to jump into anthropology. Because while Saussure started the field of linguistics, linguistics really hadn't fully taken off yet. And again, most of this work on language is interdisciplinary, and linguistics is pulling it all in and saying, all right, what can we do with this? So we have a man named Benjamin Lee Whorf, who presented an article called The Relation of Habitual Thought and Behavior to Language in 1939. It wasn't published later until the 1950s. And he created what we now refer to as the Whorfian hypothesis, or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. What this represents is, he says, there is a connection between language and thought. And in fact, what he said at the beginning, which we call linguistic determinism, big term, is that the language that you speak absolutely affects and determines your worldview. So I see the world around me in a particular way because I'm a speaker of English. And if I was a speaker of French, I would see it a little bit differently. If I was a speaker of Mandarin, I'd see it a little bit differently. The work that he did was in Native American languages, and particularly with Hopi. And one of the things that he looked at was how people looked at time and how communities looked at time. And he said, in Hopi, time is thought about circularly or cyclically. Time is something that happens over and over again. In English and other European societies, language happens linearly. Like, even look, I'm doing this. Language is a line. Let me ask you guys, where is the past? Gesture. Show me where past is. Vast majority of you are saying behind you, right? Where's the future? In front? And this is present. Sometimes that's switched for people. But what Whorf has said is we look at time as a linear entity that you can look behind and in front of you and all of these things and put it in time, like in space, I should say, time and space. According to him, we do that because our language, here English, has a past, present, and future tense. Where Hopi doesn't mark time that way in its language. You don't have to mark things that way. You can talk about tomorrow, you can talk about yesterday, but you don't actually have a grammatical category that tells you that. And because it's not inherently a part of the language, you automatically think about language differently. Because it's not marked as past, present, and future, you can think about language in a different form, but the way that we think about time, we put into space in that particular form. Do we believe this now? There have been lots of studies that say yes, there is a connection between language and thought. For example, things like if you have a language that marks nouns in terms of gender, then it might be that, if a bridge is masculine, you might see it as strong. If you have a car as feminine, then maybe it's sleek and lovely and something you want to hold on to. So there are lots of issues that they say, okay, the language structure affects the way we think. This is highly, highly controversial. Now, in terms of whether or not you agree with linguistic determinism or how it's referred to now as linguistic relativity, some people go yes, some people say no, but at the same time, this was a fundamental push forward in what we were looking at with terms of language, in comparing languages across, not just in terms of structure, but how it affected how we think. One of the biggest myths that have come out of people's views about linguistic relativity is, have any of you heard the myth that Eskimos have 200 words for snow? And it's the idea of, well, if it's, they categorize it differently because there's so many iterations and snow is around people all the time. So I just love this cartoon of do white suburban men think of 100 words for lawn. Okay, so that's where we are with Whorf. Again, just to think something differently, you have Saussure, you have Whorf. Let's see where language takes us in various areas. Okay. Next, we run to philosophy. Now, this is a lot of people that are hardcore structural, formal linguists probably wouldn't include this on here, but I love this, so I'm putting this work on here. I think it's fundamental to what we learn in language. This is straight from philosophy. Wittgenstein was a philosopher from Austria. He was a mathematician that talked about language. And in Wittgenstein's view, he wasn't concerned with what Saussure was concerned with. He didn't necessarily care about the structure of a language. He was interested mostly in meaning. And he said that the only way we understand meaning, for Saussure, meaning was this thing that we had, the sign that we kept in our head. It was this connection between an item, a little picture of a tree perhaps, and a word. For Wittgenstein, he says, it's not living here, it's living out here. And he said the only way that we understand meaning, and the main way that we understand meaning, the way that we learn meaning is by use. So I can say tree, and I can point to that thing. You're like, okay, tree, great. One of the main examples that he gives is the word slab, and I just find it a funny word, so I keep using his example for it. And he said that you could go someplace, say we're on a construction crew, and I point to something, I say slab. What does that mean? What could that mean? Contextually, right now, you have no idea. And what he's saying, or I don't even have to point to it, what he's saying is that you have to be in the point of time to really understand what something means. Now, I could, by saying the word slab, I could be pointing at something and saying, you don't understand what this object is, and I'm telling you that's a slab. Or I could also be saying, I need you to bring me that slab, so please bring it over here. And all I have to say is slab, but that meaning is contextualized. The other thing I could say is there might be, I see a slab falling, and instead of saying, that slab is falling and I think you should get out from underneath it, I could just go slab. And somebody like, and it could actually mean something else. Just realized what that probably looked like, my slab horror. So what happens is, for Wittgenstein, again, it's this idea that great, meaning is way more important than structure. We can't say that it only exists in somebody's head. We really, really have to talk about it in terms of its speakers. Language exists among speakers. The other thing he talks about is language being a game, and I love this metaphor. The idea of language is a game, and by growing up in a society, we know all the rules. Nobody has to necessarily teach us. We watch how everybody uses language, and we're like, okay, I can say slab, and you'll understand what I'm saying in this particular context. So he also brings it to very specifically a human construct. Language is human, and language is very specific to individual societies. You could pick somebody up and put them in a completely different society, and they may understand some things, but they won't fully understand what's going on, but they could over time. You can pick up anybody, put them in someplace else, and after a prolonged period of time, they'll be like, oh, okay, yeah, slab. I understand fully what that means. Okay, so here we have a more philosophical discussion. Admittedly, Wittgenstein confuses the hell out of everybody. And so it's the idea of lots of people like, it's great, but we're going to leave it to the side. But it has a really, really important piece to get the field to start thinking about language outside of only a Saussurean notion. Next, we have besides Saussure, the fundamentally most important piece of linguistics. This guy, Noam Chomsky. In 1957, he wrote his seminal work, Syntactic Structures. You might have heard Chomsky's name, probably. Most of you have, if not a linguist, then as a political radical or critic. Chomsky is still writing in linguistics. He is, or back again writing in linguistics. He took a break for a while. He is still writing about politics. But in 1957, he did a little or earlier than 57, he did a master's in what was to become linguistics, and basically it changed the entire field. Okay. Not everybody believes in the views that Chomsky has about language and what his views are in linguistics, but there is no way to deny that his work in this one particular work absolutely fundamentally changed the field. because what happened was he defined what the field was. He redefined it in his own ways. So what he said is he went back to a very Saussurean notion, and he said language is structure, but it's even more structure, excuse me, than what Saussure talked about. All right, on that note, see, we're going to talk about the biology of language because I can't speak without my throat working. Okay. So for Chomsky, his entire point, he came to linguistics not because he wanted to understand the structure of language. He wanted to understand the structure of the mind. He wanted to understand what made the human mind different. And he said language is the best way of looking at this. And so he put together something, as I said, that changed the field. And he came up with this idea that he refers to and we refer to as universal grammar. Has anybody heard this term? Okay. Now, according to Chomsky, every human, unless there's serious cognitive issues, every human is born with, doesn't learn, but it is born with this structure of language already in their mind. Okay? It's a biological, partially, construct that allows humans to use language and allows humans to acquire language and process language. So previously, people had been looking at language in terms of behavior. And he's saying, When little kids are learning language, they're not imitating anybody. And in fact, little kids produce linguistic structures that they've never heard anybody else say. But what happens is if we look at it, they all follow rules and patterns. And so Chomsky says there is a thing, universal grammar. It's this tiny little structure, and this is a larger version of it. There's a tiny little rule that everybody is born with that underlies every phrase of every sentence in any language in the world, past or present. Okay? That's huge. That is a huge way of looking at language. It's also really lovingly elegant. Be like, there's just one thing? That's fantastic. I love that idea. I don't buy it. But it's really fundamentally changed and set up the entire view of linguistics as is. And so he put this out there. And there are many, many books that came after syntactic structures where he really goes even further with this idea. And what Chomsky wants to do, or did, is he looked at language as existing in the human mind. And he talks about what he refers to as the ideal speaker-hearer. All right? So he's kind of getting rid of all of the fuzziness that exists when we talk, what happens when we exchange language. And he says that anybody, by being a fluent speaker of a language, already has all of this information in their head. We just have to access it. All right? So language is no longer out here, like Saussure and Wittgenstein and Worf have talked about. It's all in here. And you don't even have to necessarily talk to people. You can sit and be like, okay, what does this sentence do? All right, I have the data. I have the information there. This is his most famous sentence. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Because it's a really good example that for Chomsky, sentences don't necessarily have to have a particular type of meaning. Does this make sense to you guys? What do you think? Yes or no? But it could be, is it an English sentence? Yeah. So what he also says, which is fundamentally important, meaning, we're putting meaning aside. It's secondary. What we're looking at, what we're really important with, is this idea of structure. And he says we have a sentence, it comes with a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and we can split it that way. And we have an adjective, and then another adjective, and a noun, and a verb, and an adverb. So he's saying it all comes together, and every sentence in every language can be written this way. Language becomes mathematical. In fact, this was actually what got me into linguistics, because I went, oh, it's mathematical. I can actually understand this in ways that that seemed chaotic before. And so with Chomsky, he was very much like, we have to look at structure. We're trying to answer the question of what language or what the mind does. So here we have a really good example of the field being redefined, expanding based on different questions that people are asking in different disciplines in scholarship. So we have this. I'm going to come back to Chomsky in a little bit. Going to move forward to J.L. Austin, How to Do Things with Words. So this was published in 1962, but it was actually a part of a series of lectures that he did at Harvard in 1955. So what you'll see a lot right now is we're going to look at different views of books that are redefining the field that are all happening around the same time. The late 50s, early 60s, lots of things occurred in linguistics, and they were kind of happening parallel, and what we're trying to do now is pull all of them together, or at least over the last 20, 30 years. So Austin, not looking at language in terms of how Chomsky was or how Saussure was, he was like, that's great, that's fine. What he was doing is coming again from philosophy, and he started asking different types of questions. He came from a background where people were looking at meaning, right? You have a lovely sentence, something like, the cat sits on the mat. And in philosophy, people were asking things like, is that true? Well, yes, we have a mat and there's a cat and it's sitting on it. That is true. That is a true statement. And when people were trying to analyze meaning in language, it all came down to, is this a true statement? Is this a false statement? Or can we not prove it? Austin said, that's too simple. We can't do that. So again, ask different types of questions. And he said, you know what? We're not just saying things. We're not just giving information to each other when we're talking. We actually do things with language. So we promise, we swear, we threaten, we confess, we pronounce, we apologize, we think, suggest, bet, and we could keep going on and on and on. When we speak to each other, we do things. Sometimes we give information, but other times we do actions just by saying words. I will say something and I will actually do something. If I come in here and say, I promise all of you are going to get all A's this semester. Have I made a promise to you? Is it a valid promise? Maybe. I mean, I could believe it. Do I have any power over your grades? No. Okay, so we can actually ask some things like this, but I could say, you know, I promise that it's raining right now, or whatever. Like I could say, I promise that, I promise that tomorrow we'll grade papers. I can promise things to you. Whether or not I carry them out is a separate entity, but I have done something. I haven't just given you information. I've done something, and that's fundamental to language. And nobody thought about it before. We did it. We've been doing it for millennia, but nobody thought this is actually what language is. Us communicating, us interacting, us moving in forms, okay? So let's look at some of these other things. Like I can apologize, I'm really sorry. I can bet you with something. I bet the Braves will probably tank in the last game. You know, I can do things like that. I can, let's pronounce, all right, I'm gonna take you two. What are your names? Ben? Sarah. Do you know each other? Okay. Ben and Sarah, I hope you like each other because I pronounce you married. I've just done something. Have I?
No.
Technically I have. Technically I have pronounced it. Is it valid? Are they actually married? I hope you guys like it. Why is that not valid? Society, because there's societal rules that play a part. What are the societal rules here? Okay, so that's not necessarily all that. In some countries, in some cultures, that is what marriage is. That pronouncement, the right person has to come up and pronounce and then you are married. Right? In some cultures, you don't even have to agree to it, luckily. So one of the things is you guys have to agree to it. You might want to agree to it. I'll let you guys decide that later on. What else is going wrong here? Anything else? Did you?
I didn't hear it. That person earlier saying you weren't qualified?
Nobody has said that. Am I qualified to marry them? I am. I'm actually an ordained minister. And when I run through, so thank you for bringing that up. I was going to keep going until we got there. We get to the point where, when I do rehearsals at weddings, because I've done several weddings, as far as I know they're all legal, so when I do rehearsals at weddings, I don't say that final part. I do not pronounce. I can say everything else. But at the point where I say I pronounce you, then it happens. Now, the state doesn't agree with it until I sign paperwork and send that to them and they process it. So there are multiple factors involved here. But it's the idea that language has power, that we actually do things with language, right? Now you guys perked up. You're like, oh, people can randomly mirror us at various times. So this is what Austin brought up. He said, great, this is fantastic. We do things. People took it for granted. And a lot of the study of linguistics is paying attention to the stuff that everybody stopped paying attention to or just took for granted as a part of things that we do. Meaning is more than just what does this word mean. I can say tree, you can think that, but there's more to language in terms of meaning by that. Okay, I'm going to go quickly. Moving forward, a couple years, we have Paul Grice. I got so excited about putting this one in there. Oh, I did do it. And in my notes, I actually wrote the wrong title. I got so excited I put language or logic and communication. So logic and conversation, again, out of, like Austin, out of a set of lectures that Grice did at Harvard in the 60s, and then published later on. And what Grice did was he wanted to come up with kind of what Austin was doing. So he kind of expanded this idea of meaning, but beyond just meaning, he said, all right, we know through Saussure, we know through Chomsky that language has rules. And I've spared you guys. We haven't gone into grammar. You're like, oh, grammar. So I haven't gone into the actual grammar rules with you guys. But that's what the field was mostly doing. And so what happened was Grice said, all right, we have that. We have the structure of language. We have how sentences were put together, how words are put together. What I want to know is what are the rules that we follow by being speakers in a community. So he says, all right, when we have, what kind of things beyond the structure of language, besides the grammar, besides the vocabulary, what else do you have to know to be a speaker of a language? Now, technically, you could just know those things and be a speaker, and that's perfectly fine. But you all know those people who kind of get it and kind of don't. They're missing some of those social rules about language, the stuff outside the language, right? And so Grice came up with what he refers to as 4 maxims that are written here. When we speak, and he refers to it also as the cooperation principle, that we actually cooperate with one another as we're speaking. That we understand the context, we understand the environment. In this particular situation, we know that as the key speaker, I'm able to get up here and keep talking and keep talking. You guys just aren't socially allowed to just start saying stuff. You could. There's nobody stopping you. But we recognize that. But I could also call on you and say, what do you think about this? And sometimes I say, hey, what do you think about this? And I pause, and you're like, oh, I'm supposed to talk now. And you also have kind of the social rules of what you're allowed to say, how you're allowed to say it, and to what extent. So Grice, with his maxims, we refer to this as the subfield of pragmatics. It's the social rules of language. He says, quality. We assume that what people say is true. We can't overlook this fact too much, right? We just assume. If somebody comes in and says, I got all A's last semester. I don't know why I'm focused on grades. I don't normally care about that. Then you say, okay. There's no reason to doubt me saying that. If I came up to you, though, and said, my dress is blue, or my dress is red, you'd be like, what? And chances are, if I said that, you are so used to what everybody says being true or the expectation of truth that you'd be like, especially if I said something like blue. Oh, is it navy, but it looks blue to me or black to me right now? Or if I said it's red, you're like, you try to figure out something to make it work so that it is true. We have quantity. We are supposed to know how much to say in response to people. We don't keep going on and on and on. We don't have our responses to something be too short that you're not giving enough information. I'll give you some examples in a second. Relevance. Simply be relevant. We're not going off on tangents. Manner, we do whatever we can to be clear. We choose vocabulary and structures based on the situation, whoever we're talking to. We change language a lot. We kind of read the situation and make choices before that or by that. Good example of quantity that I love. And these are fun. These are a lot of fun. Go play with this. I'm going to ask all of you, just go mess with somebody for the next couple of days and see what you can do to mess with these and see what happens. If anybody ever asks you for, like, excuse me, do you know what time it is? Just say, yep. You're being true. You're being relevant. You can say yes, it could be manner is fine. But you're not giving enough information. The expectation is, I'm not asking you if you know what the time is, I'm asking you to tell me what the time is. Being a little bit too literal in that particular instance. A good example of this is also the statement, hey, how are ya? If I'm walking on the quad and I run into any of you and I'm like, hey, how are ya? Do I actually want to know how you are? Chances are no. If I do, and it's not because I'm mean, that's a separate entity. If I want to know how you are, then I'll be like, no, really, how are you doing? Because in contemporary American English, when we say, how are you? Or hey, how are you? What we're really just saying is hello. And so what happens is, in terms, again, of quantity, if somebody comes up to me or is passing me, especially if they're passing me, hey, how are you? I'm like, oh my God, really? I just had a really bad day yesterday, and I didn't sleep really well, and I woke up with a spider on my face, and then my dog sat on me. Like, you'd be like, uh-huh, well, uh-huh, I gotta go. It would just, all of a sudden, you'd realize something went wrong with that conversation. I wasn't cooperating in the way that you expected me to. You would think that I'd say. And we've all had that conversation. And you're like, oh no, this is not going right. And we learn this by being speakers. Watching little kids is really humorous for many reasons, but particularly they don't get this. While Chomsky says that we're all born with the innate ability to learn and acquire language without being taught it, we just pick it up. Same with Wittgenstein, but in a different form. Grice says, these are not things that are inherent to us, to our universal grammar. These are not inherent to our knowledge of language. We have to learn these separately. And they don't exist specifically by language. They exist by community. All right? I used to tell students, I was like, you all know somebody who doesn't get these rules. And if you don't, then it's probably you. Sorry. So it's this notion of we all, sometimes we misread it and sometimes we do things a little differently. You're like, okay, that wasn't quite appropriate, or somebody's interacting with us in a way that we wouldn't get. So again, the social rules. So in the terms, again, great works of linguistics, coming at language from a completely different perspective and saying, again, what do we do with language? What do we have to know to be a speaker of language beyond just the structure? So it really expanded the view of linguistics and the view of language overall. All right, keep going. I told you I put in too many, so we're doing a quick overview with all of this because the field is so big. Now we get to my subfield. So here we have Bill Above, written in 1972, the book Sociolinguistic Patterns. This wasn't his first book that really put him on the scene. I would say that social stratification of English in New York City, that was done 6 years earlier, but this really pushed it forward as a great work in the field. So the quote I put up here from him, he is basically what we will refer to as the grandfather or godfather, I'm Italian, of sociolinguistics. He says, I've resisted the term sociolinguistics for many years since it implies that there can be successful linguistic theory or practice which is not social. At the time that he's writing this, Chomskyan views of language are everywhere. That is the dominant part of the field. That's the dominant theories. Those are the dominant methodologies. This is the dominant view of what language is and how it should be studied. You sit in your office in your chair and you think, what do I think as being a speaker of this language? For Labov, it was, we need, the fundamental part of language is people. So we need to actually look at language as it exists and how it is used in society. Chomsky said, I'm looking at the ideal speaker-hearer. We're going to take out all the fuzziness and, when people pause and they stumble over themselves, he's like, I'm going to take away all of that. It doesn't answer the questions I want to ask. For Labov, that's the fun part. Let's look to see what people are saying and how they're saying it when they're talking to different groups of people. In sociolinguistics, I always love the fact that somebody did an entire dissertation because they put a tape recorder back when tape recorders existed. They recorded somebody for a 24-hour period. And that person changed their speech so much, depending on what they were doing, who they were talking to, what they were trying to get out of that communication, that it was just so complex that all you needed was a tiny bit of speech, and you could just really, really see the complexity of what was there. So Labov, what he did is he started the field of looking at variation in language, right? And the fact that language changes over time, and because language changes over time, we have variations in language, meaning we have multiple pronunciations of the same thing. We have multiple vocabulary items of the same thing. The example I always give, because we're at Emory, is what do you call that drink that is carbonated? It is a brown carbonated beverage. What do you refer to that as? No. According to Labov, no. That there's multiple ways of saying it. You guys have, you've drank the Emory Kool-Aid, which is Coke, and you're calling it Coke. Soda pop, whatever else you want to call it. There are multiple names for the same thing, and we exist in a society where we can call different things the same thing and be, or different, the same thing different things and be perfectly happy with that. And it reflects who we are, who we've talked to, what our backgrounds are, what our historical backgrounds are. This comes out. Do I say route or do I say route? What do you guys say? Who here says route? Who says route? Who says both? Being a linguist, I can't remember anymore, so I just say everything. So what Labov wanted to do is he said, okay, first of all, there is all this variation in language. And it's not just people messing up that universal grammar. It's not this ideal thing that people need to speak exactly the same. What he says is there is actual structure to the way people use these different variations, not just in vocabulary, but also in grammar. And one of the most fundamental parts of what Labov presented to the world and got Linguistic Society to pay attention to was that what people considered to be non-standard, even bad grammar, also had its own structure and its own logic to it. So he said that the types of language that most people just dismissed were valid, linguistically and socially valid, and this changed everything. And he looked at it, he started with creating these methods for going into communities and saying, all right, this person or this group of people speak, or this person speaks differently than this person. Is that representative of groups of people? All right, this group of people speak differently than this group of people. Let's talk about why and how and what it represents. Is it a representation of space or region? Is it a representation of social class? Is it a representation of ethnicity? Is it a representation of age? Is it all of the above or a mixture of these things? And so he really pulled out this idea. Language is just not this abstract thing that exists in our minds. It is a thing that lives in society. And people play with language. And it is a living entity that meets the needs of the speakers, and it changes to meet the needs of the speakers. When I'm talking to various people, it'll move around in a variety of places. Again, huge, huge difference from what the structuralists like Chomsky, what Saussure had said previously. People grabbed a hold of it. Now, the other view of language was so strong at the time that it really took a while for some folks to even hold on to this idea of sociolinguistics as a thing. They're like, oh no, that's just sociology or anthropology. That's a secondary part of linguistics. Or that's not even linguistics. And so it was redefining the field with really good science and saying, no, this redefines what language is and what the field is. So great book for that reason. All right, only got a couple more. Move forward in 1980. We have George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. Lakoff is a cognitive linguist. Mark Johnson is a philosopher. And basically they come up with this idea, Metaphors We Live By is the book that they wrote. Metaphors We Live By basically says the way that we conceptualize the world around us, so kind of Worfian in its capacity, is oftentimes based on metaphor. That we don't actually have to understand a whole lot of things as humans, that we can understand this because we understand this. So for example, love is war. Sports are war. An argument is war. War is sports. That's a fun one. We can go back and forth with things. War is a fairy tale. I like this. This is one of my favorite ones. The idea of war being a fairy tale is something that's so embedded in how we talk about war. And Lakoff is actually quite political and writes a lot about how different political parties use metaphor to get their point across. And so it's things with, if we want to present war, the concept of why we have to go to war or why to an audience, everybody understands from the time they were little the concept of a fairy tale. So all I have to do is say there's a victim, and there's a hero, and there's a bad guy. And then all of a sudden, like, we know this story. We can apply it here. They also talk about other fundamental aspects of metaphor, like we understand the processes up and down because we live in a body in a gravity-covered earth. So we understand concepts like that. We understand forward and backward. We understand in front and behind. And through these things, we can understand other things around us. And they say that one of the things about metaphors, and this is what they really try to pull in this fundamental work, metaphor is not just something we use in literature and say, love is a rose or whatever we want to say. It's not necessarily poetic. It's the idea that there are certain things that we don't actually understand without the metaphor anymore. So they point out things like the way that we understand illness and the way we talk about illness is through space, which sounds really weird. I'm feeling kind of down today. Yesterday I felt more up. And we can fundamentally say, all right, I understand my place in space, and so we attach different views. And sometimes all it takes is the connection to one metaphor to really work, and we have everything else. I'm going to go quickly. There's more we can talk about this, but we're running out of time, so I'm going to keep going. I'm going to totally skip that one because I want to talk about it because I changed my mind. Really good work. I'm not sure it's great. Don't tell them I said that. Here we have Michael Tomasello, which some of the faculty may remember, actually was a faculty member at Emory many moons ago. And this is if you notice, this is the only one since 1980 that I'm adding in here. And this is really just to show how different the field is now. Tomasello is a psychologist. He actually came and gave a talk last week, and his view is looking at linguistics, redefining it in the way of, we've had all of this stuff from 1916 to 1980, or really to even Chomsky, that, now I have new bugs on me. What's going on? We have all of these things that have set up the way that we're doing linguistics, and in some cases we're asking the wrong questions. So what he did was he said, let's step back. As a psychologist, he said, let's look at this again. And his question is about child acquisition of language. And he looked at gestures of non-human primates. And he went, oh, there's something going on here. And so the quick answer of Tomasello's addition to the field, which he's still developing, is the idea of that there are different parts of our minds in different types of cognition that we use for language. It's not just one little form of universal grammar in the background. All right? So this is where it is happening now. I can go into great detail about this, but you don't care, so I'm not going to. But it's the idea that even today, new great works are coming out because we're continuing to ask different questions, and we're continuing to redefine the field and to question everything. The new great works of linguistics look very different than the great works that we've had before and that we've already talked about. Also, the people that write them look very different as well, right? We have more people of color in linguistics. There are more women in linguistics. And so the field itself is developing and changing in different ways. And the last thing I will leave you with is we also have not necessarily great works for the field, but what I also find to be a great work is something that presents the field that nobody knows about to a public audience. These are amazing books that have been translated into dozens of languages that if people have never read anything, done anything scholastically with linguistics, this is a really nice introduction. And I want to point one out. Many of you have read Steven Pinker's work or seen Steven Pinker on like the Colbert Report and stuff like that. If you notice, it's hard to read up here. The quote on the bottom is from Noam Chomsky saying, an extremely valuable book. So I love the fact, like, it's valid for a public audience because Chomsky said yes to it. All right, that was a really, really, really brief overview of 100 years of a field. So thanks for joining me, and I hope you see the progression in the interdisciplinary in the definition of language through it. Thank you.
Dr. Tamasi will be glad to take your questions.
Just don't make them hard. It's the end of the day. Sure.
So you mentioned how language was, or at least somebody's idea was that language is inherently human.
Mm-hmm.
But then the most recent study with language acquisition showed a primate, and I know some primates like can learn sign language. So what is your personal opinion on that?
I will speak for both of us. It's still uniquely human. That while we might share some cognition with non-human primates, and that might overlap, and we might understand, we can look, say, at chimps to understand where the evolution of the mind brought in some of these things. But fundamentally, we've never seen language as it exists in humans in other species that we've been able to have evidence of it. Now, if you want to redefine what language is and say that all communication is language, then sure. Of course animals can communicate. I had a lovely conversation with my dog today. But having the same structural form or social form with all of these people have defined language, we don't see it. Maybe dolphins, maybe, but we haven't gotten there yet. Yeah.
So how about, what's your opinion on the, how are you, I'm well, or I'm good?
Yeah.
I know in different, I read something about it being like, well, both work, it's just where your region is or the connotation you mean by it.
Well, all of these people, but particularly this person, would say it's all good, right? If it fits within the structure of the language, and if a group of people are using it together and to have a particular set of meaning, that's perfectly fine. Now, somebody may say, well, in a formal paper maybe, or in a formal situation, you use this versus this. That's a different question. But the idea of there are lots of different versions of language that are absolutely equally good. So if I say, somebody asks me how I am, if I say I'm doing well or I'm good, both are a part of the English language structure. They might just be used by different people. I can make that question really, really, really complex and go into more detail, but I won't. So we'll talk about that later. Yeah.
So I was really interested in what you said about how on like the tape recording, their language changed a lot. I'm from Tennessee, and a lot of my friends ask me if I have a Southern accent, and I say like, well, when I want to. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes it'll slip out, or sometimes I'll turn on for a specific situation.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I'm also going to point out that you use the word slip out and turn on, which is the idea in some cases it's conscious, in some cases it's not, in many cases it's not. We all have the ability to use multiple ways of speaking, and most of us do, including multiple languages, multiple dialects, lots of different ways of speaking. I mean, it's just a natural part, and we shift between them all the time without even recognizing it. But there might be a social situation where it's better for you to choose one form over the other. Or just because you're around somebody that speaks this way versus this way, you're going to speak more like them. And this is a natural part of what we do. I always knew that my mom was talking to her mother on the phone because her New Jersey accent came out a lot stronger. I was like, oh, we're not in New Jersey anymore. Of course, that's going to be that. So yeah, it's a very natural part. And me being a Southerner with this speech as well, I get the same thing. Well, you don't sound Southern. Well, I do, but it also goes against some of the stereotypes that people have of what Southern sounds like, which brings it to a different level as well. Yeah. So say y'all with pride and pull it out as much as possible and tell people that you can switch if you want to, but you don't have to necessarily want to. Other questions? Yeah.
Tell us about what evolutionary biologists do with this.
Depends on the evolutionary biologist. Sometimes they work closely with Chomskyan views of language to try to find out if there is a universal grammar, can we connect it to genetics? Is there something in our DNA? And the FOX2P gene was something that was found ages ago that people said maybe this is what language is, and they said, oh no, we've done more studies, this isn't exactly that says what language is. And I say this a little bit cynically because oftentimes biologists will study language without actually talking to linguists about it. And geneticists will study language without talking to linguists about it. And so a lot of the work that has been done has started with not great assumptions. Not all of them. And now, because it's interdisciplinary and people are really reaching out and trying to work with different types of folks, the social aspects of this, they don't necessarily want to do much with, but the new stuff in psychology and the new stuff in cognition, especially with fMRIs, we can follow what's going on in people's brain when we give them linguistic input. They're doing stuff more and more and more with it. Some of it's good, some of it's not. Whether or not it ends up on my great works list, I'm not sure. I just don't know much about it right now. That's my circular. It's happening. Give me 5 years and I'll answer your question again. How's that? This is the problem about a really big field. It's like, yes, but I don't know. I'll teach a class, cross-list it with biology, and then I'll learn all of it. How's that? I'll do that. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a question. It's where or like when in this like development of this field of linguistics was like a phonetic alphabet developed or like thought to be necessary?
Before.
Like how long before?
Well, around the time of Saussure, it's like the late 1800s, early 1900s, when anthropologists started trying to preserve Native American languages that they were seeing die out. They wanted to create a system that no matter what language they were doing, they could write down in a way that they would be able to understand, and write it in a way that when the language did die out, we would still have record of. So the question is, I don't remember exactly what year the IPA first came out. Somebody in here might know, but that's the reasoning that it came out. And then we said, thank you, we will use that to talk about the structure of linguistics. So it actually happened through anthropology and linguistic anthropology, and then developed further. Good question.
For reasons of time, we have to stop now, I'm afraid. But please join me in thanking Dr. Tomasi.
Thank you, guys.